Our next speaker for the evening is Dr. Emma Gordon from the University of Glasgow. Emma, it's fantastic that you agreed to give a talk here. I'm very grateful, and we're very much looking forward to your talk titled Enhancing Understanding. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation. So just to say a bit about what I'm going to be doing today, I'm going to try to bring together two aspects of two research areas that I'm focused on at the moment. So my background is in epistemology. I was supervised by Duncan, so it was lovely to hear him give a talk just before me. But increasingly, I'm moving towards doing some work in bioethics as well as epistemology, where I'm especially interested in human enhancement technologies and the sort of ethical and epistemological ramifications of those technologies. What I mean when I talk about enhancement is essentially drugs and technologies that might make us better than well. So rather than treating a pathology or bringing us up to a baseline, they bring us past a baseline into this kind of better than well area. And a particularly popular view in bioethics about the aim of enhancement is that when we are designing and undertaking cognitive enhancements, what we're doing is we're facilitating or accumulating knowledge. So that's the aim. But what I want to suggest today in the spirit of this conference is that maybe we might have an alternative picture that has understanding at the center, according to which cognitive enhancement aims at understanding. And I want to think a bit about the motivations for a view like that, as well as some of the benefits of it. And at the end, to briefly say a little bit about how this might have a bearing on how we think about certain applied ethical issues around enhancement technology. So just again to say very briefly what enhancement is supposed to involve, there are several different definitions, but broadly speaking, we're talking about enhancement in contrast to therapeutic intervention or treatment. So if there's something that you're struggling with, like a particular illness or a health problem, the treatment for that would count as a therapy or therapeutic intervention. Meanwhile, something that makes us smarter than average or morally better than average, some might argue, brings us into this area where enhancement is salient. So we're talking again about, in slogan form, things that make us better than well. Now, there are different types of enhancements that are relevant in the debate. Several of those will be set aside completely for today. Roughly, we can split it up into 4 different types, I would say. So firstly, we've got physical enhancements. Here we're thinking about things like doping in sports. Then today we'll be most interested in cognitive enhancements. So currently that would be things like smart drugs and increasingly in the future probably more sophisticated drugs, as well as things like brain-computer interfaces. And the other 2 types that we'll set aside for today, but which have some relationship with some of the conclusions I'll draw, are moral and emotional enhancements, which are pretty contentious to define, but which roughly would involve improving aspects of our moral character, say making us more empathetic, for example, or helping us to feel certain emotions when we think we ought to, or to work on our interpersonal relationships in specific ways. Now, in terms of cognitive enhancement, we are further along, I think, in developing things that would count as cognitive enhancements than we are with things like moral enhancements, in part because it's easier, I think, to define what we're talking about when we look at cognitive enhancement. And just to give you a couple of examples of things that are salient for today, on the sort of less invasive side, we have things like transcranial direct current stimulation, where you have these electrodes that are attached to your head in the way that's depicted in the image that's on the slide. And at least in some cases, it seems like this helps to improve uptake of information. So there was a nice study where people were learning new skills for piloting, and people who underwent this transcranial direct current stimulation reliably took more of that information on at a faster rate. So that's one kind of enhancement cognitively. Increasingly, we've got brain-computer interfaces as well. So some of you might have read about Elon Musk's Neuralink, which is in its fullest form when it's fully up and running. It's meant to allow us to essentially access information mentally the way that we currently do with smartphones. And it also has sort of therapeutic implications for things like prostheses and such. after things like limb removal. So there are therapeutic and enhancing benefits associated with certain brain-computer interfaces. We've also got, most commonly perhaps in the human enhancement debate, a focus on neurotropic drugs. So at the moment we have things that you might count as backdoor enhancements, which means that they were developed for something else, such as methylphenidate, which is a treatment for ADHD, but they then have these benefits of slight cognitive improvement, at least in people who don't suffer from ADHD. So we've got, Ritalin in case of ADHD, and modafinil, which is a narcolepsy treatment, but which is also used, for example, in the Air Force to help pilots stay awake for longer periods of time and to help improve their working memory. It's plausible, I think, that we'll have increasingly more effective nootropic drugs, so drugs that help our cognition sharpen increasingly over time. And it's likely that they'll be similar in terms of their effects, but just more potent, which means that we can also expect things like a similar risk profile for things like dependence and addiction. So cognitive enhancements are not without potential side effects, but today we'll be interested less in issues about risk and safety and more about what it is we're trying to do when we cognitively enhance. So that was just to give you a kind of rough picture of the sort of thing we're talking about when we refer to cognitive enhancement. Now, what is it that we're trying to do then? What ought we to aim to bring about when we attempt to cognitively enhance people? For example, we might think maybe it's more true beliefs, maybe it's more knowledge, maybe it's something else. And unsurprisingly, I think knowledge is the popular picture here, in part because a lot of people working on human enhancement topics are ethicists by trade rather than epistemologists, and maybe sort of assume that knowledge should have this sort of central focus here. So what I'm asking then here is how we should think about this normative aim of cognitive enhancements. So if someone is better than well after they have had a brain-computer interface implanted or they take a drug, what is it that they have accomplished according to which we are kind of ranking them as better than well? Now, the knowledge account then is something like this, and it is, I think, the most pervasive view again. So according to the knowledge account of cognitive enhancement, what we're aiming at is facilitating knowledge accumulation. A popular bit of support for this is Hauskeller's work on cognitive enhancement, where he says as follows: cognitive enhancements are, roughly put, all interventions that through the manipulation of the human brain improve the human knowledge situation by facilitating or accelerating knowledge acquisition, processing, storage, application, or range. And this again is something that a lot of people working on cognitive enhancement simply assume is the aim of enhancement here. Now, if this is the right view, so if it is indeed knowledge accumulation that we're aiming at through enhancement, then that tells us a bit about, or gives us a particular picture of how we should assess the effectiveness of an individual cognitive enhancement and where it is that we should be putting things like research money and time and focus when we are designing new cognitive enhancements. So if we take this knowledge picture on board, then how we're assessing the efficacy of enhancements is with reference to whether or the extent to which they promote us accumulating knowledge. And in the second case, where it comes to deciding where to invest money in research, etc., what we should be doing is essentially investing in developing in whatever does best at accumulating knowledge. So that's this kind of basic picture that we get out of the view that enhancement in the cognitive realm aims at knowledge. Now, again, there's explicit support that you can see in places like Hauskeller, but there's also just kind of a tacit support that you can see in bioethics. And you might even just think, even as someone who is more embedded in epistemology, you might think the knowledge view is sort of obviously the right one, or at least the first sort of obvious candidate. But what you might be especially well placed to think about now, having just listened to Duncan's talk, is that there's a bit of a tension here between this assumption in bioethics and contemporary work in epistemology about where we want to assign the greatest epistemic value. So as we've just been thinking about, some people will argue that understanding has greater value than knowledge. And so we might want to consider then a view on which what we're aiming at when we facilitate enhancement is the accumulation of understanding rather than knowledge. So what I want to do with the rest of the time then is think first of all about a few distinctive features of understanding that are at least widely endorsed. You don't have to have exactly the same picture of understanding to get this idea up and running. But these are kind of, again, broadly endorsed views of what understanding might involve. And then what I want to do is take that literature as a guide to think about how we might have a reason to prefer this understanding account of enhancement to the kind of standard knowledge account. Then what I'll do is build on that with some implications about sort of practical import of this. So to think about what happens when we transition to this understanding view. And then I'll close by thinking about a few advantages that this view has over other accounts like the knowledge account. So in terms of what I'm thinking of when I'm talking about understanding, here I'm focused on two kind of popular discussions of understanding in the literature. One which is about understanding WH, most often understanding why, and the other which is about objectual or holistic understanding. So with understanding WH, I'm thinking about things like, I understand why you're not coming to the party, or I understand where this event is located. And then with objectual understanding, I'm thinking about subject matters or bodies of information. So things like, I understand Roman history, or I understand your family history, or anything that would count as a body of information. So when I'm talking about facilitating understanding, I'm thinking about facilitating these types of understanding. And again, it's, I think, a pretty standard position in epistemology these days to suppose that understanding either of one of the two previously mentioned varieties, or both possibly, has this higher position than knowledge. So just to take a couple of endorsements, in Whitcomb, we've got the claim that understanding is widely taken to be a higher epistemic good, a state that's like knowledge and true belief, but even better epistemically speaking. And then from Duncan Pritchard, we've got, we would surely rather understand than merely know, as well as all of the various kind of bits in favour of this view that you've just heard in Duncan's slot before mine. If we move over as well to John Quanvig's work, we can also see some thoughts about why the widespread idea that knowledge is more valuable than mere true belief is possibly mistaken under closer inspection. And I'm not going to get too far into that because it would take us too far away from what I'm trying to do. But whereas it's hard to explain why knowledge is more valuable than mere true belief or true opinion, so the Meno problem, essentially, it is easier for us to come up with this picture that is plausible, I think, and compelling about why understanding is something better than mere true belief or true opinion. So that is just a little bit of a snapshot of how epistemologists, or some epistemologists, view understanding compared to, say, the way that bioethicists think of the terrain in epistemology. So I don't want to try to convince you that understanding is better than knowledge here. You might already perhaps be persuaded by that, about that as it stands anyway, but I don't need, for today's purposes, for you to think that that's necessarily the case. I just sort of want you to follow me in thinking about what follows if it is the case. So I want to think about what happens in particular in our discussions about enhancement if we bring in this claim that understanding is better than knowledge. So if it's the case then that understanding is this thing that's better than knowledge, presumably this is going to be on account of particular features that understanding has that knowledge lacks. And again, this is a contested topic. You might have different features in mind than the ones I mentioned, or you might have additional ones that I don't talk about. But I'm going to give you just a few features we might think of as distinctive of understanding, and then consider what happens when we apply those in the enhancement debate. So understanding is in some places, perhaps, you know, for example, in Chris Kilp's work, if Chris is still here, argued to be something that's explicable in terms of knowledge. And again, I'm not going to try to settle that debate between reductivists and anti-reductivists about knowledge. Instead, I'm just going to think about a few what I'm kind of calling paradigmatic characteristics that we might associate with understanding that are not essential in the same way to at least propositional knowledge. And the first of those, maybe the most kind of commonly discussed, is this idea of grasping connections. So what Kranvig called grasping coherence-making relations, what is maybe more helpfully sometimes called grasping explanatory connections. And arguably, we don't get the same requirement with respect to propositional knowledge. A particularly good case, I think, that illustrates this is Pritchard's case where a child, for example, can get testimony about the cause of a fire and thereby know that, say, his home burned down because of a fire, and yet not have this understanding, and in particular not have this grasp of explanatory connections. So that's one thing that might be distinctive of understanding. Another thing is what you might call counterfactual manipulability. So you can see this in Grimm's work and Wilkenfeld's work, for example, where the core idea is something like being able to answer how things would have been different questions. So to take sort of your mental representation or image of the subject matter and move it around such that you can think about appropriate counterfactuals related to that subject matter. So we've got grasping explanatory connections and this counterfactual manipulability as two candidates for what makes understanding distinctive. And the third one I'm going to import today is from Alison Hills, and this is a set of abilities that she thinks comes with distinctively, again, understanding. This includes an ability to follow someone else's explanation of why P, an ability to explain P in your own words, as well as to draw from information that Q the conclusion that P, or that probably P. And also these abilities about, for example, drawing from the information Q the conclusion that, or Q star the conclusion that P star, the ability to give Q where Q is the right explanation when given the information that P, and an ability to give Q star the right explanation when given the information P star. So I'm not going to draw on all of those today, but that's the set of abilities that Hills suggests are associated with understanding WH. So those are three things then, a set of abilities, counterfactual manipulability, and grasping explanatory relations that we might think are distinctive of understanding. Now, if it's, as is widely thought in epistemology, understanding does have this greater value than knowledge, and also if it at least involves these three distinctive features, then what I think we get is some useful information, or at least some starting ideas about how we can use these insights in the human enhancement debate to get a better account than the knowledge account. So again, just to recap, the knowledge account is supposed to be something like this. So cognitive enhancement aims at facilitating knowledge accumulation. And what I think the literature in epistemology and in epistemic value in particular suggests is that a comparable and better account is the understanding one, on which enhancement aims at facilitating understanding accumulation. Now, obviously, there's some overlap here. So what it would mean to facilitate knowledge and what it would mean to facilitate understanding might be quite similar in many cases. So memory is a good example of a type of enhancement that would help both knowledge and understanding facilitation. But what I think is that there might be interesting cases where what we might enhance would distinctively facilitate understanding. And I think these again are the most sort of fun cases to think about, ones where the importing of an understanding account makes a material difference in the kinds of enhancements we would want to pursue in bioethics. And again, here when I'm thinking about what's distinctive of understanding, I'm thinking about grasping, counterfactual manipulability, and the Hills type abilities that I listed on the previous slide. So my thought is that if we enhance these, so 1 to 3, then we're enhancing not just knowledge, but also distinctively understanding. And so what I want to do now is think about this in a little bit more detail and some of the benefits of it. So these again are the 3 plausible candidates, and I want to, for each of these, give you a couple of examples of bioenhancements discussed in the human enhancement debate that seem like they might target these dimensions of understanding. So to take grasping, first of all, then, where again, what we're grasping is these explanatory links between different propositions. Up to a certain point in the human enhancement debate, there was a focus on things that had this sort of impact on you as a passive recipient. So that is less the case now, but quite often in the earlier papers and books, we find discussion of agents that just sort of act on us. So we take a pill and we get, 10 extra IQ points, or we have some brain implant put in and we know 10 extra things, where basically we just have to lie back and the enhancement does the enhancing. But what I think that we've seen as a move recently in the enhancement debate is towards what you might think of as adjunctive enhancements. And these are ones that I think would be particularly relevant to facilitating this sort of grasping between different propositions. So one way to think about the role of adjuncts is to think about how people advocating for enhancement faced a certain sort of dilemma. And this is nicely articulated, I think, by Earp's work on this particular dilemma. So roughly what this looks like is one unpalatable horn that's too radical, and then another one that is essentially too boring. So if you go with the first horn in this dilemma, what you end up focusing on is enhancements that might well be implausible, so we'll never likely get them, or if they were plausible, they face all these kind of ethical hurdles associated with autonomy and all sorts of other problems that make them too risky to be reliable as moral or cognitive enhancers. The second horn is to make the concept of enhancement stretch out so that really what we're just talking about are things like the stuff we already have. So something as mild as coffee or something like education. And then we lose what made it interesting to talk about things like cognitive and moral enhancement in the first place. So what Earp suggests is that if we carve out the middle terrain between these two apparent horns, we find this adjunctive kind of enhancement that he thinks we can pursue that is interesting and yet also not impossible or morally impermissible, like some of the more extreme early examples were. So what his suggestion is in particular is to focus on psychedelics. So there are lots of kind of example candidates here. A popular one to discuss is psilocybin, and his suggestion is that what we get from psilocybin and other psychedelics is a template of what an adjunctive enhancement would look like. So you might well think psychedelics are not a good thing to pursue or not a good candidate, but they are, I think, a good illustration of the sort of logical space that Earp is trying to carve out. So here then, what we mean when we talk about adjunctive roles for enhancements is that they are things that we sort of work in concert with. So we, for example, if it was a drug, we would take that in consultation with other people after preparation. And the goal would be that we foster a kind of state of mind or state of awareness that then lets us engage with something in an insightful way, and then later sort of call back to those experiences and reflections and apply the insights that we got in the real world. So the reason that this is relevant is that mostly in the enhancement debate up until Earp, there was a focus on things we would call determinative. So there was, the thought was you would take an enhancement in a vacuum and it would be totally outside of any work that you would do yourself or any context. And I think it's, again, when we look at this adjunctive role for enhancements that we see examples that look like they'll be particularly good at facilitating the grasping component of understanding. A few relevant examples from the empirical literature with psychedelics in particular. So there's things like reports of understanding and insight that people get from using psychedelics. And perhaps even more interestingly, increases in perceptiveness. So these are all sorts of cognitive shifts that I think would enhance understanding, specifically by helping with this grasp of explanatory connections. So that is just one example of how psychedelics could help with one distinctive property of understanding, so the grasping component. When it comes to counterfactual manipulability, I think psychedelics are a good example here as well, particularly where we see reports of increased mental flexibility. It seems like that would help us do the sort of picturing how things could have been different that is associated with counterfactual manipulability. But to take a totally different case where we think about intelligence augmentation through brain-computer interfaces, if you imagine one of those, for example, that helped you manipulate pictures and information in 3D, what you can think of, say, as an example case where an architect could develop a better understanding of where a door or a wall or a window could go through this sort of three-dimensional space manipulation. So I don't think it's just drugs that might help with this counterfactual manipulability. I think there's more kind of technological interventions that could help facilitate understanding in this way too. And then finally, when it comes to the Hills type abilities, just to take two out of the long list, I've put here an ability to follow someone else's explanation of why P, and an ability to draw from the information that Q, the conclusion that P. So these are a couple of the Hills style abilities. And I think that pretty much any pharmacological enhancement that improves cognitive abilities would be relevant here. So even just like a futuristic version of modafinil, say, that's more potent or powerful than what we have now. I think anything that's in that sort of terrain would facilitate these abilities and thereby facilitate the acquisition of understanding as well. Interestingly though, so less obviously, certain things you might think of as more emotional enhancements, so something like an empathy booster, might also assist in cultivating these Hills style abilities that help with understanding. So if you're more empathetic, you might be better able to follow somebody else's explanation by adopting their perspective. So I think that's one interesting example of how looking outside more obviously cognitive examples can still give us example cases of enhancement that facilitate understanding. So that was meant to just be like a little bit of a snapshot of some of the most popularly discussed cognitive and in this case emotional interventions that turn out to have an understanding enhancing effect when we look at these distinctive features of understanding. Now, a couple of advantages of having the understanding account in focus. One is just that it better reflects the current state of affairs, I think, in thinking about epistemic value. So as Duncan was explaining, there's this popular thinking now that understanding has this distinctive value. And to the extent that it is a more worthy cognitive aim, it seems appropriate that what we aim to enhance when we cognitively enhance is this higher cognitive aim than knowledge. And then there's a kind of action guiding property of the understanding account that's quite helpful too, I think. So it tells us if it is true that we ought to give special consideration, so research money, time, etc., to developing biotechnologies that help with those distinctive features of understanding that I mentioned. So the counterfactual manipulability, grasping, and the Hills styles abilities. These sorts of things should be the things that we're devoting research attention to if it's the case that something like the understanding view is the right one to have in mind with enhancement. This might be especially relevant if we have limited resources, so we're choosing between different sets of potential enhancements that have different epistemic outcomes as their most sort of likely result. So here the understanding account has that sort of action guiding potential that I think is useful. It also gives us, I think, a better way of assessing the extent to which we are enhanced by certain drugs and technologies, both current and future or merely possible. So we can better assess whether they are better or worse at enhancing us with reference to the understanding account and the way in which it breaks into those three sort of distinctive abilities. And I think just to finish off with kind of trying to bring this back into the applied ethics area just a little bit as well. Without the understanding account, without it sort of guiding how we're thinking, it might not be so easy to appreciate cases where the better investment is one that looks more like the psychedelic case than, say, the memory drugs case. One example case might be moral development. So if you're more interested in helping people enhance or develop their moral characters, it might be the case that targeting these sort of three dimensions of understanding would be more salient than attempting to just boost someone's sort of brute cognitive abilities or their memory. And so just to give you a sample of questions in bioethics that have some relationship, I think, to applying this understanding account, we've got, I think, several that we could use the understanding account to get some traction on. So one popular question in the enhancement debate is whether new drugs and technologies would worsen existing inequalities. So for example, exacerbate existing gaps between richer and poorer people, and an associated question of whether we should subsidize certain enhancements to make them more accessible for certain people. It would be interesting to apply the understanding view of the aim of enhancement there and see what results we get about what should be subsidized. There are interesting questions about the extent to which different aspects of enhancement promote well-being that might be usefully thought about with reference to these different dimensions of understanding. And then there are particularly interesting ethical and epistemological questions about whether it's cheating to use certain enhancement drugs in certain cases. Having this understanding view and the different distinctive features of understanding in mind might help us make more kind of fine-grained assessments when it comes to these sort of cheating charges, as well as to explore the question of whether our enhanced achievements are less valuable. So in particular, whether enhanced understanding is less valuable is a question that I don't think anyone has really talked about that much. Other than perhaps Duncan and Adam in their paper on the axiological objection to enhancement. But yeah, that's just to close a few examples of how I think we could import the understanding view into more kind of average bioethical debates and get some interesting results. But this is very early in my thinking about how to try to bring these two distinct areas of research together. So I welcome your feedback or your thoughts about how I could do better with this. But thanks very much for your time and attention.
Emma, thank you so much. We very much appreciate it. And I'm sure everyone in the audience joins me in using the virtual applause button. And we're very grateful for your talk. Enhancement and understanding, quite the topic. And if you'd like to join us with some questions, suggestions, comments, please don't hesitate. Either make yourselves known by a virtual hand or in chat. And we have a first question from David. David, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for the talk. That was really interesting. I just wanted to, I guess this is kind of a shameless plug, but I wanted to point out that your suggestion that psychedelic drugs are a way of sort of enhancing understanding is, we gain some support from the kind of theory of grasping that I like, which grasping is experience. Obviously, I'm not an expert in that, but part of what these drugs can do is kind of expand your field of consciousness, what can enter your consciousness. And so there's kind of a direct line of support here if you take that kind of view. And I guess I'm curious to know what you think about that.
Yeah, that's great. So I would be interested in reading about your preferred view. So the plug is helpful. But it sounds like there's kind of a natural fit there because there is this almost indescribable experiential component to psychedelics, and then if you think experiential, there's this important experiential dimension to grasping. Yeah, it feels like there'd be a natural fit. If there's anything you think I should particularly read about this, feel free to email it to me if you have time, and I'd be happy to check it out.
So just a quick follow-up, because this was I had a question and I wanted to give way to Chris and Bloody in a second, but this is exactly on point. So suppose that we're trying to prove some logical theorem, exactly as so just a case, right? And suppose that we have a cup of coffee, okay? And that really changes our experience, right? We're now sort of more in the flow, we're absorbed by solving the problem. The experience has a particular feature to it. And suppose we, in some sense, get to understand that better, okay? Perhaps as a causal result. I won't say as a consequence, I won't say it's grounded, but as a causal result, we get that, okay? So, Did we enhance our cognitive agency? Perhaps in some ways, did we lose part of our cognitive agency? Perhaps in other ways, because we needed the physiological boost. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. So
that I think is one of the most pervasive questions on human enhancement, is basically where's the difference maker in cases where in particular we think something is lost in terms of value. So for example, if you think some enhanced achievement is less valuable, sort of at what point and in virtue of what? You know, some people, there are very bioconservative people that think that there's any sort of whiff of anything that's enhancement related and you are losing something probably because of the difficulty that's removed or something like that. And then there are other sort of more bioliberal folks that say, well, at least up to a point, as long as you still say exhibit what you know, Duncan is calling a strong cognitive achievement, you know, if you still exhibit that, then that doesn't matter if you're enhanced, you still get the valuable achievement. So I think there's a bunch of different ways or frameworks that you could apply to try to get an answer to your question, but I think that there's pervasive disagreement about where the difference maker is, if that makes sense.
But it could be both, right?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Okay, yeah, all right. Just pointing that out. So thanks so much to David for the question and to Emma for answering. And next up we have Chris. Chris, please go ahead.
Hey, Emma, thanks very much. That was super interesting. Throughout the talk, I was thinking I was going to ask you about whether the understanding account and the knowledge account are like incompatible in any interesting way, because it seemed to me always as though, well, we could enhance for both, right? That would be great. So we kind of don't have to choose, but like, you know, then you said about, you know, and rightly so made a point about limited resources and so on, and that gives us a reason to favor understanding. Now, that made me think of another thing, which is that, like, you know, I mean, the excess epistemic value of understanding is precisely that, over knowledge is precisely that epistemic value. Yeah. Right. But once we're sort of starting to talk about how we allocate your resources, probably the value that we're most interested in is practical value. Yeah, and it becomes a discussion about instrumental value, I guess, at that point. Yeah. What does that make you want to say about the two views, or where would you go with that, basically? Yeah, indeed. I mean, so then I wonder whether you know, understanding has additional practical value over knowledge. I mean, like, you know, given that, I mean, you know, maybe what we should really enhance for, if we're sort of talking about practical value and allocating resources, is true beliefs, right? I mean, those are pretty good. But like, you know, I mean, at any rate, I think a really important discussion will be, you know, what the relative value, practical value of understanding compared to knowledge, compared to true belief is. Yeah, good. So, and I think that's a separate discussion from what, like, you know, people in epistemology have agreed upon. Yeah, and I think that, so I don't really think anyone's having this discussion so far, but I think that they should, based on what you've just said. The particular sorts of cases, I think, where understanding might have more instrumental value, even, I think, are maybe moral enhancement cases where it's a kind of blurring of the line between cognitive and moral. So it's like cognitive with moral import or something like that. That might be a case where maybe understanding would have more practical value. But I don't know. That's just like a first pass thought about this. So good question. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, I mean, there are these people who think that in order to act well morally, you got to act from understanding, right? Yep. So, I mean, you know, that sort of, I guess it's a practical question as well as a moral question. So if we want to, like, you know, we want to act morally well, so that's at any rate a concern to take into consideration. So maybe that's something to bring into the discussion as well. Yeah, definitely. And maybe you and I can talk about this more at some point as well. Thank you. Thanks, Emma.
All right, thanks so much, Chris, for the question, Emma, for answering. Next up, we have two very quick questions, if possible, from Vladi and then from Elena. Vladi, please go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question about, about enhancement drugs and psilocybin included. As far as I am concerned with experiments of psilocybin with students, those notions of achieving higher level of understanding were self-reported. So my concern is how do we access, how do we estimate the genuine understanding from just the feeling of understanding? And also, and the other part of this is that actually when creating some drugs for stimulation, for nootropic drugs like phenibut, like paracetam, which are often used by students in highly competitive academic environments. They are involved in metabolic pathways of the brain, and they could enhance understanding, but it's like a side effect. It's not intended effect. So when we develop some drugs, we cannot focus on specifically on understanding.
Yeah, so I think the first point you made, which is about the self-reported nature of the results, I think that's actually a problem that is pervasive again in this whole debate. That I think it's Immaculada de Mello Martin has a paper, The Trouble with Moral Enhancement, where she takes issue with like a lot of the empirical literature that's cited in favor of claims about moral enhancement. So I think the self-reported nature of results about psychedelics might mean that that papers like ERPS maybe overstate the impact of understanding, and there's a question there about how do we even measure it appropriately in order to assess whether, say, psychedelics are a good moral enhancement. That might just be that might well be like an intractable problem, the self-report part of it. The second part, I wasn't quite sure what the question was. I think part of what you were saying was that you could get understanding from certain enhancement or certain potential nootropic drugs, but that result would be a side effect. But I wasn't quite sure what you were asking. Sorry if I didn't hear you properly.
I can put it simply. The drugs focus on specific metabolic activity rather than a cognitive process. They could enhance understanding, or they could not. We don't know. It's not how they are developed.
But that isn't to say that we could not develop drugs in association with some sort of research about which metabolic pathways are most reliably associated with certain outcomes. So I guess that would be imperfect, but to the extent that we could figure out what pathways are being activated or used when people are developing more understanding, maybe we could get something useful from that. But I do see what your point is, and I think part of both of your comments basically make me think about how there's sometimes like a bit of a gap between the imagination of bioethicists and the reality of what could actually be produced. And part of, I think, what people like ERP are trying to do is bring this discussion to somewhere where, again, it's radical enough to be interesting, but we're actually talking about something that could happen or something that we could design or could have a certain degree of control over. So I mean, I think, to be honest, I think you've just hit on like genuine problems for this debate. So thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Vladi. And I think Adam might have a very quick follow-up.
Yeah, I just had a follow-up on that interesting question from Vladimir. It seems like it would be helpful in the empirical literature on psilocybin to try to get around the self-reported aspects of some of these studies, that they sort of like give them some tests like the Allison Hills ability tests. So can you follow the explanation? Can you do this? Control case, no psilocybin, experimental case, psilocybin, and then sort of figure out a way to measure it further. This would just obviously be more helpful if some of the literature did this rather than report on just, self-reported sense of understanding. It's just a thought. Obviously, we can't make people do those studies, but it would be nice if they did.
Yes, I think it also depends what we're trying to facilitate too. So a lot of the psychedelics work is about moral enhancement, and it's way harder to do the Alison Hills type test in those cases. But to the extent that we're just trying to facilitate, say, someone's understanding of some like complicated narrative or something that happened in their family, if it's like a kind of sort of therapy context or whatever, these cases look like ones where you could run the kind of test you're talking about. But I think, yeah, it depends on the domain, whether you could run that test. But interesting thought.
And then again, who's to know them better than themselves? So they
yeah.
Who knows? Anyway, okay. So fantastic question. So Elena, you're up next. Please go ahead.
So first, I just wanted to say thank you. That was great. That was amazing. I had two curiosities, but the second one was kind of already addressed. I was just curious. You mentioned you presented a lot of advantages, and I fully agree with those. Regarding risk, however, let's put addiction aside. Do you already have, I don't know, insights regarding major risks such as, I don't know, changes of personality or losing memory, or I don't know, or something like that? That was my curiosity. And second, but kind of addressed already, I was curious, how well can you actually monitor understanding enhancement? I mean, to my knowledge, whenever you're put to some test like this, it depends like the day you're having and the context and so on. So how easy is for you to say, this is the improvement, like 5% improvement, he knows 10 more things, or no, right? So how easy to measure?
Good. I think with it, so to take the second one first, because we've already been talking about that a bit, I think that is a serious problem for all. It's not just, I guess it's not just associated with enhancements, it's to do with any studies that have this sort of self-reported lab-based quality to them. So I think here I'm thinking partly about situationist critiques, where, you know, the stuff about whether your character is stable, and the fact that we are so flexible in response to things like ambient sounds and noise and smells and things like that, that I think this is, I think you've hit upon a problem. It's not an enhancement specific problem, but it is a very big problem for, I think, attempts to study the impact of enhancements. I think Adam's suggestion about sort of using kind of almost comprehension tests that are understanding ability related are good, to the extent that we're trying to focus maybe mostly on kind of cognitive domains or intellectual kind of domains. But when we move to things like moral enhancement, I think that it just isn't as effective. I can answer your first question, so I'm glad to hear you asked that. So about the risks, one major risk is re-experiencing previous trauma. So if you have a certain history of traumatic experience, people report sometimes like basically, flashbacks or sort of almost PTSD type experiences during psychedelics. That of course, that is partly predictable based on history, but not completely, because we don't always recall, for one thing. The other risk that's not so much about trauma, but is about your point about character, is that there are interesting results about people really like flipping their religious commitments after psychedelic experiences in both directions. So again, I've not read the papers, only a commentary, so I need to go back and actually read where the resources are for this. But there are people who were not spiritual who have these kind of spiritual experiences, and then there's that shift. And then there are people who were in some way religiously committed who just issue the commitment after the psychedelic experience. Where I read about this was in a paper about informed consent for enhancement that's psychedelic, because there's this particular worry about personality changes. If you'd like me to send you the papers that are relevant or anything like that,
that would be great.
If you drop me an email and just mention what it was, I'll send them to you, because it sounds like you find this exciting. So I'd be happy to. And thanks for the positive feedback too. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Elena, and thanks, Emma, for answering the briefest of questions, if I may, right at the end, coming from me. I'm just wondering about the phrase in your title, right? Enhanced understanding. So suppose, well, you know, I usually have this example because I guess I'm sloppy and I like coffee a lot. But suppose, you know, I'm playing a game of chess and I have a cup of coffee, okay? And it seems to me afterwards, sort of causally speaking, that I understand the position on the chessboard better than I did before, okay? But that is in some sense so fleeting. I might genuinely understand it, but it's so fleeting, it doesn't sort of sediment into how I conceive of the position. So that I wonder exactly what it is that gets enhanced, right?
Yeah.
So need the progress in understanding in question be lasting in any way, or can it be ephemeral, right? Could it possibly be something that's sort of a flash of insight and then it just poof goes away, right?
Yeah.
Or
I
yeah,
almost feel like or what you think about that will probably be guided by what you think about unenhanced cases where the same thing happens. So do you attribute understanding to the person who has that insight without the coffee, or do you attribute something less than understanding to them?
I mean, I'd be tempted to say that, look, if it's genuine understanding, you should in some sense be able to retrace your steps, to reconstrue it, to regain at least large chunks of it, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if it's completely a one-off and then you completely forget it, it doesn't seem as though is the kind of lasting understanding that sort of typifies, well, what we would describe in true ascriptions of understanding.
Yeah,
that might be
I'm
one.
inclined to think that's right too. The reason I asked you was just because I almost wondered if like if the enhancements or the coffee was almost like muddying your intuitions about the case. So I thought like taking it out might help us better think about whether we count fleeting instances like that as understanding full stop, never mind whether we count them in cases of cognitive enhancement. But I think you're right that just the standard is not met there, but it's not because of the coffee that it's not met, if that makes sense. It's because of the fleeting nature.
Right. But then again, if I could reconstrue large chunks of it without the cup of coffee, how exactly is it that the coffee enhances the understanding?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to put that exactly. I'm not even sure if it does. That's the thing. I think this is what you've done. Basically, I've written down a few bullet points as you were saying this. Is you've created, I think, a really nice set of like subsets of questions about this that are underexplored. And this talk was like really just like the briefest beginning stab at thinking about what if we orient this debate in thoughts about understanding rather than knowledge, which is the norm in the bioethics literature. And I think even just from this short Q&A, I've got like about 15 other questions that bear on that central question. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
This has been absolutely fantastic, and we're very grateful, Emma, for your talk. And I think we will all get a bit of enhancement via dinner afterwards. Well, in some cases via breakfast or lunch. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone who's joined from the US. And this has been absolutely fantastic. And please join me once again in thanking Dr. Emma Gordon. And that concludes our evening. And see you again tomorrow. Thanks again. And I'll stop the recording right now.